Story number 1. The snowbound hitchhiker. The snow was coming down thick, swallowing the road ahead like a slow-moving avalanche. My wipers struggled to keep up, barely carving out enough visibility to make the drive manageable. It was the kind of night where no one should be out. Not on foot, not even in a car. But then I saw him. A figure stood at the side of the road, half hidden by the swirling snow. He wasn't waving for help, just standing there, watching as my headlights cut through the dark. Everything in me told me to keep driving, but there was something about the way he stood, rigid, unmoving, like he'd been waiting just for me. Against my better judgment, I slowed to a stop. The man stepped forward and, for the first time, I saw his face. Or at least I thought I did. His hood was pulled low, shadows obscuring most of his features. But his eyes, there was something wrong about them. Too dark, too hollow. He opened the passenger door without hesitation, as if he knew I'd pick him up. "Cold night," he said as he slid in. His voice was flat, like the words were more of a statement than small talk. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white photograph. A long, tattered coat, boots caked in ice. He didn't shiver, didn't rub his hands together for warmth. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. He turned his head slowly, like he hadn't considered the question before. "Just down the road." I pressed the gas, keeping one hand on the wheel, the other clenched tight on my thigh. The silence between us stretched. The snowstorm outside thickened, making the night feel endless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air inside the car felt too still, too heavy, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The moment he got in. A few minutes passed. Then he spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped." I gripped the wheel tighter. "What?" His head turned toward me, and I swear I could feel his eyes drilling into my skull. "Most people don't." I forced a chuckle. "Guess I'm just nice like that." He didn't laugh. I kept my eyes on the road, but in my peripheral vision, I noticed something unsettling. His reflection in the passenger side window, it was off. The glass showed his silhouette, but the face wasn't his. It was blurred, shifting, like a distortion in an old TV screen. My hands went clammy. I swallowed hard and focused straight ahead. The highway was nothing but an endless tunnel of white. The trees lining the sides, disappearing into the dark. I stole a quick glance at the rearview mirror. Nothing but the road behind us. Snow covering my tire tracks almost instantly. But when I looked again, my stomach twisted. There was something in the back seat. A shape. A shadow. I whipped my head around, but the seat was empty. My heart pounded against my ribs. I had to be imagining things. The storm, the exhaustion. It was messing with my head. Then his voice cut through the silence again. "You ever hear the story?" I forced myself to keep my tone casual. "What story?" "The one about the man who picks up a hitchhiker, drives him through a storm, then realizes he's been dead the whole time." A cold sweat broke out along my neck. My fingers ached from how tightly I was gripping the wheel. "Never heard that one," I muttered. He hummed, the sound low and unnatural. "Some say the driver dies that night. Others say he just disappears." The headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed for half a second before flaring back to life. I swallowed the lump in my throat and pressed harder on the gas. "How much further do you need to go?" I asked, voice tense. He didn't answer. I turned my head just for a second. He was staring at me, lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. The headlights caught something up ahead. A road sign, bent at an angle from the wind. But there was something else, a car, a wreck, half buried in snow, just off the shoulder. My blood turned to ice as I recognized it. It was my car. Same make, same model, same shattered windshield. A hand poked out from the driver's seat, limp, frozen, and the face, my face, staring up at the sky, eyes glazed over with frost. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screaming against the ice. I whipped around to the passenger seat, empty. The door was wide open, snow swirling in like an unwelcome guest. My heart hammered as I threw the car into drive, speeding away from the wreck, from the impossible. My breath came in sharp gasps, my pulse a wild drumbeat in my ears. The road stretched on endlessly, the blizzard swallowing everything behind me. My mind raced, searching for logic, for an explanation, but there was none. Then, a whisper. You shouldn't have stopped. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't turn my head. I just drove. Hours later, I reached a gas station at the edge of the storm. I stumbled inside, hands shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps. The attendant looked up from the counter, eyes widening. "You okay, man?" he asked. I nodded stiffly, rubbing my arms. The warmth inside felt unnatural after the bone-chilling cold of the drive. Just a rough night. He nodded toward the window, where my car sat, coated in a thin layer of ice. "You came down the highway?" "Yeah." His face darkened. "Bad stretch of road. Lot of accidents." I exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I saw one." The attendant frowned, looking past me like he was searching for something. "You alone?" My mouth went dry. I turned my head, slowly, dreading what I might see. The car sat there dark and empty, but in the passenger window, just faintly, was a handprint. I turned back to the attendant. His expression was unreadable, his gaze locked on mine. "You shouldn't have stopped." And then, the power went out. Story number 2. The frozen cabin. The road to the cabin was barely visible beneath the heavy snowfall, the trees bending under the weight of ice. The wind howled through the forest, rattling the windows of my car as I drove deeper into the mountains. The rental listing had described the place as secluded, but as the signal bars on my phone disappeared one by one, I realized secluded was an understatement. The plan had been simple: a weekend getaway with 3 close friends. No work, no stress, just a quiet escape. But something about the place felt off the moment we arrived. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making every sound seem louder. Even the snow seemed to fall too quietly. The cabin itself was small, built of old wood that groaned with every gust of wind. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed how cold it was. Not the normal bite of winter air, but a deep, unnatural chill that made my breath come out in thick clouds, even with the fireplace roaring. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph. Above the mantel, an old black and white image of the cabin itself, taken long before we arrived. By nightfall, the unease had settled into my bones. The others didn't seem to notice. They laughed, poured drinks, played music too loud, drowning out the eerie stillness outside. But I kept catching small things. The door to the bedroom creaked open on its own. The kitchen chairs were slightly moved when I glanced back at them. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. Then the knocking started. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the wind. A soft tap, tap, tap against the window. I glanced outside, expecting to see branches swaying against the glass, but there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of white, the snow covering any possible footprints. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice too quiet. Just the wind, Marcus muttered, waving a dismissive hand. The others agreed, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from the other side of the cabin. Then the back door. Then the small window near the ceiling. The knocks moved, as if something was circling us. My stomach twisted. The wind was strong, but it wasn't strong enough to knock with such deliberate rhythm. I walked to the window, pressing my face close to the glass. My breath fogged the surface. The trees swayed in the distance, their skeletal branches reaching out like fingers, but just beyond the tree line, barely visible against the snow, stood a figure, a person. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. There's someone out there, Marcus laughed, shaking his head. No way, who'd be out in a storm like this? I turned to the others, expecting their faces to mirror my fear. But they only looked at each other before shrugging it off. You're seeing things, Olivia said, her voice light, dismissive. I turned back to the window. The figure was gone, but the snow remained untouched. No footprints leading in or out of the woods. The night stretched on, and the temperature inside dropped further. No matter how much we stoked the fire, the cold refused to lift. At one point I swore I saw my breath fog up inside the bedroom, as if the heat from my own body was being pulled away. Then the knocking stopped. A relief settled over me, but only for a moment, because in the silence that followed I heard something far worse. Breathing, slow, shallow, coming from inside the cabin. I turned my head toward the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms. The others were in the main room with me, all accounted for. But in the dim light, I saw something move, a shadow, shifting just beyond the doorway. I grabbed my phone, fumbling for the flashlight. My fingers trembled as I aimed it down the hall. The beam flickered slightly before settling on the open bedroom door. Nothing. The room was empty, but the sheets on one of the beds were pulled back like someone had just been lying there. A whisper echoed through the room, a voice so quiet I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Don't look away. The light flickered. My breath caught in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then Olivia let out a choked gasp behind me. I spun around just as she stumbled backward, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. There's someone in here, she whispered. The air shifted, the temperature plummeting so fast my skin burned with the cold. The candles flickered violently, the flames stretching unnaturally tall before vanishing all at once, plunging us into darkness. Then the laughter started. Not ours. It came from everywhere. A low, guttural chuckle that seeped from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air around us. My skin prickled. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then came the whisper. You shouldn't be here. The front door slammed open with a force that sent a blast of icy wind through the room. Without thinking, I grabbed Olivia's wrist and ran. Marcus and Ethan followed, their footsteps pounding against the wooden floor as we burst out into the storm. The snow swallowed us instantly, the cold biting into our skin, but none of us dared to stop. The cabin loomed behind us, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching our escape. I glanced back only once, and what I saw still haunts me. A figure stood in the doorway. Not quite human, not quite there. Its body flickered like a candle, about to go out, shifting in and out of existence. But its face was mine. The next morning, we reached a nearby town, half frozen, barely able to speak. We told the locals about the cabin, about what we saw. Their expressions darkened. "There is no cabin out there," one of them finally said. "Burned down years ago. Whole family died inside. You must have been lost in the storm." I shook my head. Number we were there. The man's eyes held something unreadable. "Then you were never alone." I still don't know what we encountered that night. All I know is that we barely made it out. And sometimes, when I sleep, I hear that whisper again. "You shouldn't be here." Story number 3. The last passenger. The snow was relentless, coming down in thick sheets that blurred the streetlights and swallowed the road ahead. I had been driving for hours. The city behind me now, nothing but a distant glow, swallowed by the storm. My phone signal had died 30 minutes ago, and the Uber app had frozen, leaving me stranded in the system with no new rides. Just one more fare, I told myself. One more, and I'd call it a night. Then the request came through. It was strange. No location, PIN, just an address, typed in manually. A gas station on the outskirts of town, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and the black outline of trees buried in the snow. The pickup time said now, as if they had been waiting. I almost ignored it, but something about the silence in my car, the creeping unease of the empty roads, made me hesitate. A passenger meant another voice, another presence to break the stillness. So I accepted. The gas station was dead when I pulled in. No attendant, no other cars, just flickering neon lights, humming against the cold. The air outside was thick with falling snow, making the world seem smaller, quieter. And then I saw her. She was standing beneath the station's awning, wearing a thin coat that wasn't nearly enough for this weather. Her long dark hair clung to her pale face, her breath coming out in slow, heavy clouds. She didn't move toward the car. She just stood there, staring. I rolled the window down slightly. "Uber?" She nodded once. No smile, no greeting. Just a small, almost mechanical movement. I unlocked the doors, watching her closely as she slid into the back seat. "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. A pause. Then, in a soft, flat voice, she said, "Home." I glanced at the address. It was deep in the wooded outskirts, miles away from any real neighborhood. My gut told me something wasn't right, but the storm was getting worse and my options were limited. The ride was silent at first. She didn't speak, didn't fidget, didn't even shiver. Just sat there, staring out the window, her reflection barely visible in the frost-covered glass. A few minutes in, I tried again. "So, were you waiting out there long?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "A while." Her voice sent a strange chill down my spine. Something about the way she spoke, like she was choosing each word carefully, deliberately. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. That's when I noticed it. The rearview mirror. I could see her sitting there, clear as day. But her reflection, it was wrong. She was facing forward, her head tilted slightly down, hands resting in her lap. But in the mirror, she was staring directly at me. My grip on the wheel tightened. The road stretched on endlessly, swallowed by the storm, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. The temperature inside the car seemed to drop. My breath started fogging up, despite the heater blasting at full power. My fingers ached from the cold, and the steering wheel felt like ice beneath my touch. Then she spoke again. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I forced a chuckle, though my voice came out strained. "That's a weird question." She didn't react, just kept watching me through the mirror, unblinking. "They say," she murmured, "that Sometimes the dead don't know they're dead, that they keep going, reliving the same moment over and over. The words sent a deep, crawling unease through my chest. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to stay on the road. Yeah, I've heard that before. She tilted her head slightly. Do you think you would know if you were one of them? Something about the way she said you, as if she meant it specifically, directly made my skin prickle. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then something moved, not her, something behind her. A shadow flickered in the rearview mirror just for a second. A dark shape shifting in the back seat. My pulse slammed in my ears. I whipped my head around. Nothing. She was alone. I sucked in a sharp breath, turning back to the road. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. I think you missed the turn. Her voice was soft, almost amused. I blinked. The road ahead was unfamiliar. Tall trees loomed on either side, heavy with snow. But that didn't make sense. I had been following the GPS exactly. I glanced at my phone. The screen was black. Dead. My throat was dry. I don't think... A whisper from the back seat. Not her voice. I felt it more than heard it. Breath against my ear, the faintest brush of sound. My entire body went rigid. My hands shook as I forced myself to look in the mirror. And that's when I saw it. A second face behind hers. Pale, twisted, grinning too wide. Eyes black, empty, hungry. Its mouth moved soundlessly, whispering words I couldn't hear. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screaming against the ice. My breath came in ragged gasps as I whipped around, expecting something. But the back seat was empty. The door was open. Snow blew inside, swirling around like grasping fingers. I stumbled out, my heart slamming against my ribs, looking around frantically. The storm had swallowed everything. No footprints, no sign of her, just the empty road, stretching into the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I barely made it home, my body running on pure adrenaline and terror. The next morning, I checked the app, desperate to prove that I had imagined it all, that I had actually picked someone up. But there was no record of the ride. No trip history, no last passenger. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses in mirrors and windows, shadows, reflections that didn't match. And sometimes, when I drive alone at night, I hear it again. That whisper. Close, right behind me. And the worst part? My rearview mirror still shows an empty back seat. But sometimes, I see the breath marks on the glass. Story number 4. The basement below. The house was silent when I arrived, wrapped in the suffocating stillness of winter. Outside, the snow piled up against the porch steps, swallowing the road behind me. The storm had settled in for the night, thick and relentless, isolating me from the rest of the world. I had agreed to house sit for my friend David while he was away, thinking it would be easy money, a warm place to stay, some food in the fridge, and a paycheck at the end. But as I stepped inside, I felt it immediately, that deep, unshakable sense that I wasn't alone. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic. The house wasn't ancient, but it had that unsettling quality, like the walls had absorbed too much history. I dropped my bag by the door, rubbing my hands together to chase away the cold that seemed to linger in the air, despite the heating. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic thudding, slow, distant, coming from below. I froze, my ears straining. The house was supposed to be empty. David hadn't mentioned anything about pipes knocking or strange noises, and yet the sound was unmistakable. Something was moving beneath my feet. I swallowed hard and shook it off. Old houses made noise. Pipes settling wood. Maybe even rats in the walls. I forced myself to ignore it, moving to the kitchen to make some tea. The kettle hissed, filling the space with steam, and for a moment, I let myself relax. Then, the basement door creaked open. I nearly dropped the mug. Slowly, I turned. The door was open just an inch, revealing the pitch black descent beyond. I knew I had closed it when I arrived. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter as I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then from below, the sound came again. Thud, thud, thud. My breath hitched. This time it was louder, closer. It wasn't the sound of pipes, it was the sound of footsteps. I told myself to be rational. Maybe a draft had pushed the door open. Maybe it was an old heating system knocking against the foundation. But deep down, I knew better. Slowly, I walked toward the basement door. My footsteps felt deafening against the wooden floor. I hesitated before reaching out, pressing my palm against the door to push it shut. Then, I heard the breathing. Slow, labored, just beyond the threshold, down in the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The air around me felt thick, heavy. The house seemed to close in, the walls pressing against me. The breathing didn't stop. It stayed there just beneath the floor, waiting. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I tapped David's name. It rang once, twice. Then, "Hey man, what's up?" I exhaled sharply. "David, does your house have issues?" A pause. "What kind of issues?" I turned, staring at the open basement door. "Something's in the basement." David went quiet. Too quiet. Then finally he spoke. "You didn't go down there, did you?" His voice sent a new kind of fear through me. "Number why?" Another pause. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Lock the door. Now." A shiver ran down my spine. "David, what the hell is going on?" His breath was shaky. "I don't know. I just lock it. Don't go down there, no matter what you hear." A loud thud shook the floor beneath me. I jumped, my grip on the phone tightening. "David, someone is down there." "No," he whispered. "It's not someone." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my pulse a wild drumbeat in my ears. The basement door remained open, the darkness yawning like a hungry mouth. The breathing had stopped, but that somehow made it worse. I forced my legs to move, stepping forward until I could reach the handle. My fingers trembled as I gripped it, slowly pulling the door shut. The wood groaned as it swung closed. I reached for the lock. Then something knocked from the other side. Hard. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The knock came again, more urgent this time. A slow, deliberate rhythm. "Let me out." The words weren't spoken. They weren't even whispered, but I felt them, seeping through the door, pressing against my skull like an unspoken command. I turned and ran. I locked myself in the bedroom, wedging a chair against the door. My heart pounded, my ears straining for any sound, but the house was silent again. I don't know how long I stayed like that, my body rigid with fear, my breath shallow. The storm howled outside, wind rattling the windows. But inside, the silence was suffocating. Then, just as I started to convince myself that I had imagined it, that maybe I was just exhausted, I heard it again. Not from the basement, from inside the room, breathing, slow, ragged, right behind me. I spun around, my phone flashlight trembling in my grip. The light landed on the closet door, slightly ajar. The darkness beyond was thick, unmoving. And then something moved, a shape, a figure, a twisted, contorted thing that barely resembled a person. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I ran. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the storm. I never went back. David refused to talk about it after that night. He sold the house months later. When I asked him why, his face went pale. I locked the basement door before I left, he said. The night before you got there. I know I did. He swallowed hard. But when I came back, the door was open, and there were footprints leading out of the basement. I haven't spoken to him since, and I haven't stepped foot in another basement since that night, because sometimes things that belong below don't like to stay there, and sometimes they follow you home. Story number 5, the library that whispers. The library was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few scattered students hunched over their books, the fluorescent lights casting a dim yellow glow over the long wooden tables. Outside, the snowstorm raged, thick flakes piling up against the windows, muffling the world beyond. It was the kind of night where no one should be out, but I had a deadline, and I needed the quiet. I made my way to the farthest corner, where the shelves were taller, and the lights flickered more often, and the silence felt heavier. The air back here always smelled different. Dusty, stale, like the books themselves were aging into the walls. I dropped my bag onto the table and pulled out my laptop. But as I settled in, a noise stopped me, a whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath against the stillness. I turned, scanning the aisles behind me. Nothing. Just rows of books stretching into the dimly lit distance. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The minutes slipped by. I typed, read, sipped my coffee. The whisper came again. This time, it was closer. I snapped my head up, heart thudding. The library was supposed to be silent, but there it was, a low, urgent murmur just behind the nearest shelf. My skin prickled. I stood slowly, stepping toward the sound, my breath shallow. Hello? My voice barely rose above a whisper itself. No response, just books, just silence. Then something shifted. A book slid off the shelf, falling at my feet with a dull thud. I stared at it, my pulse hammering. The title was faded, the edges worn. The book had no dust, no signs of neglect, like someone had been reading it. I bent down, hesitating before picking it up. My fingers brushed the cover, and the air around me changed. The lights above flickered, the buzzing growing louder. The library, once warm, was suddenly freezing, my breath curling in the air. I shivered, gripping the book tighter. Then I heard it again, a whisper, right against my ear. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. No one. And the library stretched out, still and empty. But the whispering didn't stop. It was all around me now, voices layered over one another, some frantic, some pleading. Help us. The words sent ice through my veins. I dropped the book and stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. My eyes locked onto the shelves, onto the gaps between the books. There were eyes staring back, not human. Dark, empty voids that seemed to pulse, shifting as if the shelves themselves were breathing. The voices grew louder, swelling into a desperate chorus, whispering things I couldn't understand. Then, silence. The air was still. The library returned to its previous state, the lights humming softly, the whispers gone. The book still lay at my feet, closed. My hands trembled as I reached for my bag, ready to get the hell out of there. But then something else caught my eye. The book I had dropped. It wasn't the same anymore. The cover had changed. It now had my name on it. My blood turned to ice. My hands shook as I reached for it again, hesitating before flipping it open. The pages were blank at first. Then words began to appear, forming as if written by an invisible hand. You are not alone. I snapped the book shut and shoved it onto the shelf, backing away as fast as I could. My breath was shallow, my body screaming at me to run. And then I saw her. A girl, standing at the far end of the aisle, half hidden by the shelves. Her clothes were old, faded. Her hair hung limply around her pale face. And her eyes were the same voids I had seen between the books. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She lifted one hand and pointed behind me. I turned, dreading what I would see. The rows of bookshelves stretched on endlessly. Too many. More than there had been before. The library had changed. The exit was gone. A slow, creeping dread settled in. The whispers returned, now playful, taunting. The books around me began to move, shifting on their own, sliding from the shelves like unseen hands were reaching for me. I bolted. My footsteps pounded against the floor as I sprinted between the aisles, the shelves twisting, stretching. Every time I turned, the rows realigned, blocking my path. The lights flickered, and I could hear them now, the voices, the whispers, the laughter. Then, up ahead, I saw the front desk, the exit. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran for it, my vision blurring. Just a few more steps. Something grabbed my wrist. I let out a strangled cry, twisting away. Cold fingers, too long, too thin, slid off my skin as I stumbled forward, crashing into the desk. And suddenly, it was over. The library was normal again. The lights were steady, the books in place. The snow outside still fell in thick waves, tapping against the windows. But my wrist, where it had grabbed me, was ice cold, the skin tinged blue. I didn't look back. I grabbed my bag and ran into the storm, the library door slamming shut behind me. I never went back, never spoke about it. But sometimes, when I pass by that place, I see it. A book, propped up in the window display. The title changes every time, but the meaning is always the same. Come back. Story number 6. The Watcher in the Fog. The road ahead was barely visible, swallowed by the thick wall of fog that clung to the earth like a living thing. The snow had stopped, but the air was heavy, thick with moisture that turned my headlights into a useless, hazy glow. I'd been driving for hours, the highway stretching endlessly before me, each mile blending into the next. It was late, too late, but I just wanted to get home. The silence inside my car was suffocating. The radio had started crackling an hour ago, the signal cutting in and out. And eventually, I turned it off. Now, the only sound was the faint hum of my engine and the rhythmic thud of my tires against the icy road. Then I saw it. A figure, standing motionless on the side of the highway. I barely had time to react. My foot hovered over the brake, my grip tightening on the wheel. The person didn't move, didn't wave for help, just stood there, half hidden by the swirling mist. As my car rolled past, my headlights swept over them for just a second. It was a man, tall, thin, his clothes ragged and stiff with ice. His skin was pale, too pale, but what sent a jolt of cold terror through me was his face, or rather the lack of one. There were no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, frozen skin stretched over bone. I slammed the gas pedal, my heart hammering. The figure disappeared into the fog behind me, swallowed up as if it had never been there. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, my fingers ice cold against the wheel. It had to be a trick of the light, a shadow, an illusion created by exhaustion. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the road, closer than before. My stomach twisted, a deep primal fear sinking into my bones. He hadn't walked. He hadn't moved. And yet, there he was. I pressed harder on the gas, my car skidding slightly on the icy pavement. My pulse roared in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gulps. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look back again. But I felt it, the weight of his gaze, even though he had no eyes. The fog thickened, curling around my car like grasping fingers. The world outside the windshield disappeared, leaving only a narrow stretch of road, illuminated by the weak glow of my headlights. The air inside the car grew colder, my breath turning to mist. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, not behind me, beside me, pacing the car. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My head turned just slightly, and my stomach dropped. He was keeping pace with me, his feet never touching the ground, his body gliding effortlessly through the fog. His head was tilted toward me, as if watching, as if waiting. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screaming against the ice. My body jerked forward, the seatbelt biting into my chest. For a moment, everything was still. Then I turned my head. He was gone. The road was empty. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing the dark silhouettes of trees lining the highway. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. I was exhausted, sleep deprived. My mind was playing tricks on me, but then something tapped against my window, software slow, deliberate. I turned my head, dread pooling in my stomach, a hand, pale, boneless, pressed flat against the glass. My body locked up. My breath caught in my throat. My skin prickled with the overwhelming sense that I was not supposed to see this, that whatever was out there, whatever was watching me, did not belong in this world. The fingers dragged slowly down the window, leaving streaks of frost in their wake. Then the whispers started. Software, almost gentle, dozens of voices, layered over one another, slipping through the fog like a melody I couldn't understand. Then one voice rose above the others. "Let us in," I screamed. I don't remember hitting the gas. I don't remember driving. The next thing I knew, I was miles away, the fog behind me, my car swerving dangerously across the icy road. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, tires skidding to a halt, my hands locked around the wheel. The station was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly against the dark. I stumbled inside, my legs trembling beneath me. The clerk looked up, his face creased with mild concern. "You all right, man?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. He glanced past me, toward my car, his brow furrowed. You came from the highway?" I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. "You see anything out there?" A shiver ran down my spine. I forced myself to meet his eyes. "Why?" He hesitated, then leaned in slightly. His voice was lower now, cautious. "People see things out there sometimes. Shadows in the fog. A man standing on the road." My blood turned to ice. "You've seen him?" The clerk shook his head. "Not me. But my brother did." His eyes darkened. "He didn't come back." A long silence stretched between us. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in my ears. Then, from outside, something knocked against my car window. Software, slow, deliberate. The clerk paled, his face draining of color. His gaze lifted over my shoulder toward the glass doors leading outside. I turned. The fog had returned, and standing just beyond the reach of the station's flickering lights was him. Story Number 7. The Forgotten Guest. The lodge sat deep in the mountains, buried in a thick layer of snow that stretched for miles in every direction. It was the kind of place you booked when you wanted to get away from everything. No traffic, no noise, just endless white wilderness. The rental ad promised warmth, comfort, and isolation. It was exactly what we were looking for. We arrived just before sunset, 5 of us packed into one car, our luggage stuffed in the trunk. The drive had been long, the winding roads is barely visible under the growing storm. But the lodge was beautiful. Rustic, wooden walls, large windows overlooking the trees, a fireplace already stacked with wood. The host had been kind enough to leave the heater running, so the place was warm when we stepped inside, shaking the cold from our bodies. There was a note on the dining table next to a bottle of wine and 5 glasses. Welcome. Enjoy your stay. 6 guests booked for the weekend. Please check in at the front desk on departure. We laughed about it. Just a typo, we figured. There were 5 of us, not 6. But as the night went on, that tiny mistake started to feel less like an error and more like a warning. The first sign came when Ethan went to get firewood. He stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door open just a crack. A gust of wind pushed it wider, sending a sharp chill through the room. That's when Olivia swore she saw something. There's someone out there. We turned to look, but all we saw was the snow. The trees swayed in the wind, their dark branches scratching against the sky. Ethan came back a minute later, stomping the snow for his boots. "What?" he asked, seeing the look on Olivia's face. "Nothing," she muttered, shaking her head. "Thought I saw something." The second sign came an hour later. We were gathered around the fire, drinking, playing cards, laughing about the storm raging outside. That's when I noticed it. The chairs around the dining table. There were 6. I didn't remember setting them all up. I didn't remember pulling out the extra one. But there it was, tucked neatly against the table, as if someone had been sitting there the whole time. My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. The third sign came just past midnight. The power flickered, just for a second. A brief pulse of darkness that swallowed the room before the lights returned, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. That's when Olivia gasped. "What?" Ethan asked. She pointed toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Someone was just standing there. We turned. Nothing. Just the open door to the dark hallway leading to the empty rooms beyond. "You're freaking yourself out," Marcus said, but his voice wasn't as confident as usual. We tried to laugh it off, to shake off the growing unease that had settled over the room. But the night didn't let us forget. At 2 a.m. we heard footsteps, software slow, moving across the upstairs hallway. We all heard it. We sat frozen, listening as the sound traveled above us, moving from one end of the lodge to the other. Then it stopped, right above us. No one spoke. No one moved. We just sat there staring at the ceiling at the spot where something or someone was standing. Then came the whisper. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. Just a soft murmur, like wind slipping through the cracks. But it was enough. We ran. We grabbed our jackets, our boots, our bags, throwing open the front door, despite the storm raging outside. The cold hit us like a wall, the snow blinding, the wind howling. But we didn't care. We piled into the car, slamming the doors, breath fogging up the windows. Ethan turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. Panic set in. We fumbled with our phones, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. We sat there, trapped in the car, staring at the lodge through the windshield. That's when we saw it. Through the window, standing in the flickering light of the fire, was a figure, motionless, watching. It wasn't one of us. And then the lodge lights went out. The car engine roared to life. Ethan didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, sending us skidding down the icy road, away from the lodge, away from whatever had been inside. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, an hour away. We stumbled into a small motel, shaking from the cold, from fear, from the impossible. We told the clerk what happened. His face paled. "That lodge," he said. "It hasn't been rented in years." We stared at him. "That's not possible." He nodded, his voice grim. "The last group that stayed there," he hesitated. "They never left. 5 guests checked in. 6 were found." I don't remember what we said after that. I don't remember anything except the cold, settling deep in my bones. The whisper still echoing in my ears. We never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, when I wake up in the dark, I feel it. Like someone is still watching. Like we never really left. Story number 8. The man in the motel mirror. The storm had swallowed the highway, turning the road into a blur of white and shadow. My wipers scraped uselessly against the windshield, barely keeping up with the snow. I had been driving for hours, exhaustion settling deep into my bones when I saw the glowing vacancy sign flickering through the storm. A small roadside motel, the kind that looked half abandoned, its neon lights buzzing weakly against the cold. I didn't have a choice. The storm was only getting worse. The lobby was empty when I stepped inside, except for an old man behind the counter. He barely looked up as I approached, his fingers tapping against an ancient-looking register. The air smelled stale, thick, with a scent of dust, and something faintly metallic. I pulled out my wallet, ready to check in. "Just for the night," I said. The old man slid a key across the counter, his hands slow, deliberate. "Room 12, he muttered, barely glancing at me. Then, as I turned to leave, he added, "Don't look in the mirror." I stopped, turned back. "What?" But he had already turned away, staring at the small, static-filled television in the corner of the room. I waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. The air in the lobby felt heavy, pressing against my skin. Finally, I shook it off and headed for my room. Room 12 was at the very end of the hall. The carpet was worn, the walls yellowed with age. I unlocked the door, stepping into the freezing air of the small, dimly lit space. The heater rattled weakly in the corner, doing little to push back the cold. A single bed, a desk, a bathroom door slightly ajar, and on the wall, opposite the bed, a large rectangular mirror. I thought about what the old man had said. Don't look in the mirror. It was a stupid thing to say. A joke, maybe. A way to mess with the weary traveler stuck in a snowstorm. But as I set my bag down and peeled off my jacket, I felt it, that small, nagging itch of unease creeping up my spine. I turned toward the mirror. My reflection was normal, tired, hollow-eyed. I looked away, shaking my head. The storm rattled the windows, wind howling against the thin walls. I sat on the bed, rubbing my face, exhaustion pressing down on me. I needed sleep. Just a few hours, then I'd be back on the road. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, like something moving. I froze, listening. The heater rattled, the wind howled. But beneath that, something else. A slow, deliberate shift. The sound of weight, moving against the floor. I turned my head toward the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. The reflection had changed. I was still sitting on the bed, but my reflection wasn't looking at me anymore. It was staring past me toward the bathroom door. A wave of ice-cold Fear washed over me. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering. The bathroom was empty. The door stood slightly open, just as it had when I arrived. I looked back at the mirror. My reflection was watching me again. Every hair on my body stood on end. My chest felt tight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It had to be exhaustion, a trick of the light. I shook my head, forcing myself to lie down. I closed my eyes, tried to slow my breathing. Then, creak. The bed shifted. I went rigid. My body locked up, every muscle frozen in place. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it, like someone had just sat down beside me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My skin prickled with the overwhelming sense that if I turned my head, if I opened my eyes, something would be there. The room was silent. Then, the whisper. Low, close, right beside my ear. Why did you look? A jolt of terror shot through me. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I lurched forward, flipping on the bedside lamp, heart hammering. The room was empty. The door was still shut. But the mirror, I wasn't alone in the reflection. A figure stood behind me, tall, gaunt, its skin pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over its skull. Its mouth was open in a soundless scream, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I spun around. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was closer. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My reflection was no longer my own. The thing was me now. Same clothes, same posture, but the eyes, the face, wrong, twisted, grinning. The lights flickered. The air turned ice cold. Then the reflection moved. Not me. The thing in the mirror. It took a step forward, and then it pressed both hands against the glass. Let me out. The whisper slid through the room like a blade, slicing through my panic. I lunged for my bag, grabbing my keys, shoving my feet into my boots without tying them. I didn't care. The lights flickered again. The whisper turned to laughter, low, guttural, reverberating through the walls. Then, crack, the mirror. A single jagged crack ran down the center, splintering through my twisted reflection's face. I ran. I don't remember bursting through the motel door. I don't remember flying down the hallway, past the empty front desk, past the old man who didn't even look up as I sprinted into the snow. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my fingers trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires skidding against the ice as I sped away, the motel shrinking in my rearview mirror. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The next town, shaking so hard I could barely speak. I checked into another motel, one with bright lights and no mirrors in the room. I barely slept. The next morning I searched for that motel online. Nothing came up. No listing, no address, like it had never existed. But when I checked my back seat, in the reflection of the motel window, there was a single jagged handprint on the glass, pressed from the inside. Story number 9, The Silent Caller. The gas station was dead silent, the kind of quiet that made the ticking clock on the wall sound deafening. Outside, the storm had buried the world in white, the snow piling up against the glass doors, making it look like no one had been here in years. I was on the night shift, alone, as usual. It wasn't a busy station, just a forgotten stop on a desolate highway, the kind of place people only pulled into when they were desperate. The heater rattled weakly behind. The ice the counter, barely keeping the cold at bay. My coffee had gone lukewarm, and the security monitors flickered lazily, showing empty aisles and a parking lot swallowed by snow. Nothing but endless, frozen quiet. Then the phone rang. It startled me, the sudden shrill noise cutting through the silence like a knife. I frowned, glancing at the old landline mounted on the wall. No one ever called this phone. It was just there, collecting dust, meant for emergencies. But it kept ringing. Reluctantly, I picked it up. Hello? Silence. Not static. Not breathing. Just nothing. I waited a few seconds, then hung up. Probably a deadline, I figured. Maybe the storm had messed with the wires. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the creeping unease that had settled over me. 5 minutes later, it rang again. I hesitated before answering this time. Gas station. Again. Nothing. Just that empty, suffocating silence. I exhaled sharply, my nerves starting to fray. Look, if this is a joke, it's not funny. Still, no answer. Then, just as I was about to hang up, there was a faint sound, a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard it. Soft, distant, like someone speaking from the other end of a long tunnel. My stomach twisted. The whispering stopped, and the line went dead. I placed the phone back on the receiver, my hand slightly unsteady. The store felt different now, like the air had thickened, pressing against my skin. I glanced at the security monitors. The aisles were empty. The parking lot was still a snowy wasteland. But something felt wrong. Then the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer, but I did. Hello? The whisper returned. Louder this time. Urgent. The same faint, hurried murmuring, just out of reach. I strained to understand, but it was like listening to someone trapped behind thick glass. Then, finally, a word broke through. Outside. I shivered, my eyes flickered to the monitors again. Still nothing, just the endless storm. Then the power flickered. For a brief second, the store went completely dark. The hum of the lights died, the heater rattled, and the security monitors shut off. My breath caught in my throat. Then, just as quickly, the power returned. The lights buzzed back to life. The heater groaned. The monitors blinked on. And that's when I saw him. A figure, standing just outside the glass doors. My heart lurched into my throat. He hadn't been there a second ago. He was facing the store, motionless, his head tilted slightly downward like he was staring at the ground. He wore a long coat, stiff from the cold, the hood pulled up, shadowing his face. I swallowed hard. The phone slipped from my hand, hitting the counter with a dull clack. I turned my gaze back to the monitors, my pulse hammering. The figure hadn't moved. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe he was just a traveler caught in the storm. Maybe his car had broken down. I took a shaky step toward the door. Sir, do you need... The lights flickered again, and he was gone. My breath hitched. I whipped my head toward the monitors, scanning the parking lot, the road, the snow-covered gas pumps. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. A cold dread settled deep in my gut. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. Then the phone rang again. I didn't answer. I just stared at it, my chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The ringing stopped. The silence stretched. Then, from outside, a knock, software deliberate, right against the glass. I turned slowly. There was no one there. The knock came again. 3 slow taps. I backed away, my entire body screaming to run, to get out, but my legs wouldn't move. My gaze flickered to the monitors, and that's when I saw it. The cameras had changed. Instead of showing the aisles, the parking lot, the store, every single screen was showing the same image. A close-up of my own back. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. No one was there. But the air was different now. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was waiting. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it with a shaking hand, pressing it to my ear. I didn't speak, but it did. Behind you. The lights cut out. The store was swallowed in darkness, and something breathed right next to my ear. Story number 10. The abandoned tunnel. The snowstorm had swallowed the road behind us, turning the world into an endless blur of white. The only thing visible ahead was the mouth of the tunnel, a gaping black void carved into the mountainside. We had been driving for hours, the winding roads barely visible beneath the fresh snowfall, when we saw it, an old railway tunnel, abandoned, its entrance half buried in ice. Ethan was the first to suggest stopping. "It looks like a shortcut," he said, peering at the barely visible tracks leading inside, or at least a good place to wait out the storm. Something about the tunnel made my skin crawl. It was too quiet, too still. The snow wasn't even falling near its entrance, as if the air itself avoided going inside. But the wind was howling, and the temperature was dropping fast. We had no other choice. We pulled the car just inside the tunnel, the headlights slicing through the thick darkness. The interior stretched on endlessly, the stone walls slick with moisture, icicles hanging from the ceiling like frozen teeth. The railroad tracks ran deep into the blackness, disappearing into the unknown. "This place is creepy as hell," Olivia muttered, hugging herself. "Better than freezing to death," Marcus replied, shutting the engine off. The silence that followed was suffocating. We sat there for a while, the only sound our own breathing, the occasional creak of the car as it adjusted to the cold. The headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead, but the longer I stared, the more I felt like something was staring back. Then the sound came, a distant lick, clack, faint at first, echoing through the tunnel but growing louder. I turned to Ethan. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. It was rhythmic, steady, like footsteps or a train. The idea made no sense. This tunnel had been abandoned for decades. The tracks were rusted, barely intact, but the sound didn't stop. Click-clack, 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 coming closer. Then the headlights flickered, just for a second. A brief pulse of darkness that swallowed everything. And when the light returned, there was a figure standing further down the tunnel. I barely had time to register it before the lights flickered again, and it was gone. Olivia gasped. "Tell me you saw that." No one spoke. The headlights flickered again. This time the figure was closer, not walking, not running, just there. Then the car battery died. Darkness swallowed us whole. For a second, all I could hear was my own heartbeat, loud and erratic in my ears. I reached for my phone, the screen casting a weak glow over the car. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. I turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. Something was coming. A shape moved in the darkness, barely visible in the dim light of my phone. It was tall, impossibly thin, its body distorted, its limbs too long. And then I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its head tilted slightly, like it was watching us. The air turned frigid. My breath came out in thick, shaky clouds. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle, my entire body screaming to run. Then, the whisper. Software right, next to my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I lunged for the door, shoving it open, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. The others scrambled out after me, their breath sharp, ragged. The tunnel groaned. The walls trembled. And then, deep in the darkness, a train horn, long, haunting. Olivia grabbed my arm. "That's not possible," she choked. The wind howled through the tunnel, a sound so unnatural it made my skin prickle. Then, in the distance, lights flickered on. Not ours. They were headlights, coming fast. A train, an impossible train. The ground vibrated beneath us. The air filled with static, a low hum that made my teeth ache. The tunnel seemed to close in, the darkness thickening, suffocating. "We have to go!" Ethan shouted. We ran. The snow outside was blinding, but I didn't care. I stumbled forward, lungs burning, every instinct screaming at me to get out. Behind us, the sound of metal screeching against metal roared through the tunnel. A train's whistle, long and deafening, filled the night. Then, silence. We didn't stop running until we reached the road. When I finally turned back, the tunnel was dark again. Still, no train, no sound, just a gaping void in the mountain, untouched by time. The car was still inside, but I wasn't going back for it. We never spoke about that night again. It's our told what we saw. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the wind howls just right, I swear I still hear that whistle. Calling me back. Story number 11. The wrong house. The snowstorm had turned the roads into an endless white void, erasing any sense of direction. My phone had lost signal miles ago, and my GPS had frozen on the last set of directions before the screen went completely black. I was lost. My hands tightened around the wheel. My breath fogging up the windshield, despite the heater running full blast. I needed to find shelter. Fast. That's when I saw it. A house, standing alone in the middle of the storm, its porch light flickering weakly against the wind. It wasn't on the map. There were no signs, no roads leading to it, just a narrow driveway, barely visible beneath the thick layer of snow. But it was my only option. I pulled in slowly, the tires crunching against the ice. The house looked old, but not abandoned. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, but the porch light suggested someone was home. I hesitated, my gut twisting with unease. Something about the place felt off, but the cold gnawed at my bones, and I had no choice. I stepped out of the car, pulling my coat tighter around me as the wind howled through the trees. The front steps groaned under my weight. I raised my fist and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the door. It opened. The air inside was warm but stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic. The living room was neat, the furniture arranged as if expecting guests, but there were no signs of life. The fireplace was cold, the kitchen dark, but something was wrong. There were coats hanging by the door, shoes by the mat. Someone lived here. Hello? My voice barely carried through the house. Silence. I stepped further inside, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The walls were lined with framed photographs, but as I looked closer, my stomach twisted. The pictures were old, faded, black and white, but each one had something unsettling in common. In every single photo, the people were standing in the exact same position, same posture, same expressions, like they had been posed. I swallowed hard and kept moving. Down the hall, a door was slightly ajar, light spilling from the gap. My pulse quickened. Someone had to be home. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. I pushed the door open. It was a bedroom. Neat. Almost too neat. The bed was made, the dresser was dust-free, But there was something strange about the mirror on the wall. It was cracked, a single jagged line splitting the glass down the middle. My reflection looked back at me, but something was off. The crack distorted my face, stretching it unnaturally. Then behind me, movement. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. The hallway was empty. But I knew. I had seen something shift in the mirror. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. I needed to get out. I turned back toward the front door, my steps quick, unsteady. The air felt heavier, the walls pressing in. But as I reached the living room, I froze. The pictures, they had changed. The same people were there, in the same stiff poses. But now, their heads were turned. Their eyes were looking at me. My pulse roared in my ears. My skin prickled with a sensation of being watched. I took a shaky step back. The lights flickered, and then, from upstairs, a slow, deliberate footstep. I bolted for the door. The handle was ice cold beneath my grip. I twisted it hard, locked. I hadn't locked it. Another footstep, then another, coming down the stairs. My breath hitched. I forced myself to turn my head, to look. A figure stood at the top of the staircase, tall, still, its face. It wasn't a face, it was my face. Distorted, stretched, wrong. My reflection from the cracked mirror. It tilted its head, watching me with my own hollow eyes. Then it moved, not walking, not running, gliding, coming straight for me. I threw myself at the door, yanking, pulling. The lock clicked. The wind slammed into me as I stumbled outside, the cold searing my lungs. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I dove into my car, hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. My breath came in ragged gasps as I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning before catching grip. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the storm. I drove for hours, my mind racing, my pulse refusing to settle. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling as I gripped the wheel. The attendant looked up as I stumbled inside, my face pale, my breath uneven. "You all right, buddy?" he asked. I swallowed hard. I stopped at a house up the road. Needed shelter. His face darkened. "What house?" "The one just off the highway. Had a porch light on. Looked, lived in." The man's expression turned to something unreadable. He exhaled slowly. "That house burned down 50 years ago." I stared at him. "No," I whispered. "I was just there." He shook his head. "You went to the wrong house." My stomach dropped. And then, behind me, in the gas station window, a reflection. Not mine. Watching. If you made it this far, you're officially braver than most. But tell me, have you ever experienced something unexplainable? A moment that sent chills down your spine? Share your horror stories in the comments. I'd love to read them. And if you enjoyed this terrifying tale, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more chilling stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss what's coming next. Also, check out the videos appearing on your screen right now. You won't want to watch them alone. Stay safe and keep the lights on.